There are hundreds of videos that haven't been launched on YouTube on Patreon. Make sure you guys join the Patreon to help us grow. We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. We're going to be talking today about creation and the end of the world. Your host, Eric Lambert, and I'm going to be having a good friend of mine join us here. I expect to go into various topics. I know it will be quite an interesting roller coaster, but when we think creation and the end of the world coming from a Abrahamic religious view, or Christianity, if you will, we think of God creating the earth in 7 days in the biblical narrative, and the end is going to happen with fire. Well, that isn't the only story that's out there. And today, I have my good friend, John F. White, with his YouTube channel, Crecganford. Make sure you guys go subscribe, hit that bell on his channel, get notified for everything that he does. He spends a lot of time in mythology, in Nordic mythology, Celtic, Germanic, you name it, and other stuff, Proto-Indo-European topics, different studies of different mythologies, even down into the Greco-Romans, and finding that there is a common trace that still exists, even down into the Greco-Roman stuff, that is traced back into antiquity. Welcome to the channel, my friend.
Hello, Derek. Thank you. Let me join Myth Vision again.
Thank you. So it sounds like we're a little past time for Ragnarok to be taking place, I suspect. Was there a doomsday, did they think it was supposed to happen at some point back in the day, or?
It could have happened multiple times. There are theories that it happened, the world created again, it happened again, and it recycles. The world is in cycles. So a lot of people think that. But yeah, unlike maybe some Abrahamic theories, there's no set date, there's no complex calculation you can do to try and work out whatever date you want, which seems to be the case in Abrahamicism for the end of the world.
It reminds me of the Aztec and some of the Native Americans, if I'm not mistaken. They held to a cyclical view of, but also I've even heard, and this is like more on the fringe theories, that some people, for example, in the New Testament, in the Jesus era, if you will, he believed that the end of the age was about to happen. And they don't talk like as in the end of everything, but it's the end of a certain age. And a lot of people who are into astrotheology or the studies of astrology, they believe that Jesus is kind of a symbol, if you will, not a literal guy. And they would say he is the Lamb of God. He is Aries the ram, putting an end of Aries and getting into the age of Pisces. So there's this idea that the apocalypse, the end of Aries, and the new age is upon them. So it might fit. I don't know. It might fit into what you're saying. So
they're saying based on stars tens of thousands or millions of light years away, based on where they are, determines what happens to this planet. Is that what you're saying? just to make sure I'm sure.
I mean, just like astrology.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay.
That's all it is astrology. They believe that you go far enough back. For example, they'll use the Abrahamic idea of Moses and the golden calf, the golden bull, where they come out of Egypt and they're in the wilderness, and Moses goes to talk to God, and he says, "Don't worship the golden calf." Aaron, his brother, and sure enough, they worship, and then he destroys them with the golden calf. Some argue that, and this is probably fringe again, that the calf is actually representative of Taurus, the sign of Taurus, and that the destruction of Taurus was moving them into Aries. And some will argue like Abraham going to sacrifice his son on the mountain, and then God replaces his son with a ram. That idea is like the Aries sign. He's like, this is totally fringe, probably, but either way.
Okay. So like Tauroctonies, they call that. So we sacrifice a bull for worship. So that's Mythicism did a lot of that. So cows were quite valuable, and within Norse culture, the more valuable thing you sacrifice, the bigger the sacrifice would mean to the god you're sacrificing to. And you would sacrifice to the god you wanted to on the day. So if you wanted to go to war, you sacrificed to maybe Odin or Thor. If you wanted to make love, you sacrificed to Freya. If you wanted to whatever you wanted, you sacrificed to the god that needed it. That's how they worked. Although Thor was probably the middle class god, call it. So most men would worship Thor or
Interesting. Interesting.
but think. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. I was going to say
Okay.
the creation myths that you went into. Let's talk about creation first,
Sure.
because you went into Proto-Indo-European ideas and ancient stories about a cow being in the myth. Is that also in the Nordic myth?
Yes. So a Thumbler is the name of the cow in the Nordic myth. And so you have this primordial being that's created Ymir, which I said means twin. So it's neither man nor woman, it's both. So it could in effect have sex with itself to create beings. And it created the Jotun, who are sort of monstrous eating beings. They're sometimes called giants, but that isn't really what they are. And then the cow who licked the ice created, in effect, a god, Bor. And then the Jotuns and the god got friendly, and there's a bit of a haziness in the descriptions we have. But then after that, there was a whole load of gods and a whole load of giants. And then there was a bit of a battle, and then it was left with one giant and a few gods. That's sort of how the pantheon starts up proper. So yeah, that's how that is. And the main god, as we hear about, are Odin, Vili, and Ve, all brothers. But when they get, so what's interesting is when they get to Earth, so they kill the primordial being, which is a common mythology in these Proto-Indo-European myths and all their descendants. They kill Ymir, create the world, and I think you said that Yahweh has done that in some form, kills a serpent.
Yeah.
So they create the world, come down, and Odin, Vili, and Ve, or Odin, Onir, and Luthor create people from two trees, Asker and Embla, meaning ash and elm. So that's how. So there's no Garden of Eden, no man or woman doing something bad.
But there is the trees in their narrative.
Lots of trees. So trees are quite important. So you've got Yggdrasil, which is in effect the world tree, people call it. And Yggdrasil actually means, in effect, Odin's horse, which is quite interesting. So it gets complicated. So people talk about Odin hanging himself from the Yggdrasil. Are they talking about Odin hanging himself from a tree? Or are they talking about him hanging his horse? So that's something that goes on. And why is he associated with the horse? So we can shoot off many ways here. So the horse, so you want to say the tree narrative, but it's connected to the horse narrative, and the horse narrative is probably connected to something like the Wild Hunt, which is another myth we sort of touched on briefly, again common throughout Europe, because the leader of the hunt, which was the person actually not leading it behind it, chasing the dead, was a horse at one point, either a man-eating horse or a half horse, half man. It developed. But the outside, yeah, you've got this big world tree. And in the Norse thinking, people talk about different worlds, the 9 worlds of the Norse. It's not really worlds, it's realms, because they're all part of the world you're on. And to the north, it's cold, and to the east, it was hell-like. You had the sea around you, and the sea was held in by a fence, and around that fence was the world serpent. So the Midgard serpent, who eventually had a fight with Thor. It's the end of the world, and we've only just started, so we won't jump there just yet. And that's how it started. And then the gods came down, and they were sort of enjoying themselves, playing games, bathing in gold, and just enjoying life. And then a few things happen. Okay, so we get into these details. Let's see if there's any links to the myths you know. So what happens is, the world tree has things happening in it, within the tree. So at the top, there is a bird, an eagle. Although within the Prose Edda, it says there's also a falcon. And some people visualize this as a falcon on an eagle. But actually, it's just one bird, and they're just calling it different names. But there's one eagle overlooking everything. Then within the tree, there are 4 stags. Male deer meant to be roaming around chewing the branches. And there's also a squirrel, Ratatosk. Ratatosk is a gossip, basically. So the eagle sees the world and says things to Ratatosk, and then here Ratatosk runs down the tree, and at the bottom of the tree is Nithhogger. This is this scaly serpent who, again, we see at the end of the world. He gnaws the roots of the Yggdrasil, and Ratatosk the squirrel comes down and tells him, "Oh, the eagle just said, like, nasty, horrible, slimy person. He doesn't like you." Nithhogger would say, "Oh," to Ratatosk, "he's an evil, good-for-nothing, lying bird," and Ratatosk will run up and down. And so these serpents, there are other serpents as well at the bottom, the roots, gnawing the roots. You've got these stags eating the branches. And so they had this perception that the Yggdrasil was already crumbling, was already being eaten from within, holding the realms of the world together. And so
Interesting.
It was due to fall apart anyway, and you had to try and keep the world tree growing and healthy.
Huh.
That's just a start off of it. There we go.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any the only commonality between that and the Genesis one that I see, and maybe Mesopotamian, is the fact that there is well, I don't even know if it's in the Mesopotamian, but there's definitely the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then there's the tree of life. But there's two trees in the garden, and Adam is the first man, but it is interesting. We don't know if it seems like out of Adam, female is what comes from his side. Some say he was split in half, because a lot of times the God of the Hebrew Bible, when he makes a covenant with his people, like Abraham, he cuts the birds in half. He cuts the sacrifice gets cut in half. And so it's split in two, whereas some say it's from his rib that Adam comes. From Adam's rib, there's Eve, creates male and female. So the idea of them coming out of each other into two is in there. And then you also have the serpent, which, if you look at the story, it does appear that the woman is near a tree. It appears, at least in your mind, because she's looking at it. It seems it's almost like you play a picture, like she's looking at the tree, and then the serpent is saying to her, "Why don't you have a bite? Eat." And she says, "I'm not even supposed to, touch at all. Like, I'm not even supposed to have anything to do with this." And he says, "Yeah, but why?" Pretty much like poking at the girl. And she says, "Well, we'll die. If I eat of the tree, I'm going to die." And he says, "No, that's not true. God knows that the day you eat of the fruit, you'll become like a god, and you'll know good and evil. That's why he doesn't want you to eat it. He doesn't want you to know better. He doesn't want you to know things like gods do." And in Genesis, it's interesting because in the language, it's plural, as though it sounds like many gods are creating man and female. Like, it's like God says, he says something like this: God says, "Let us make man in our image." And a lot of people like Dr. Price and others, and even Dr. Richard Carrier will tell you, the critical scholars will point out, this doesn't sound like one God, like monotheism. It sounds like maybe henotheism, where there's a supreme God above all gods, but he's commanding the other gods and saying, "All right, now we're going to create man in our image, like the gods, but there's one supreme." And later on, you get the story in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible where, well, there's only one God and God alone. But really often in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, I refer back and forth in case of Jews watching, it sounds like he's the God of gods. Like, there are other gods, but he's the supreme one. I'm rabbit trailing, but I just figured I'd tell you that because...
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I haven't thought about this, but this you've just enlightened me a little bit. So, all the gods are down in the garden, their fields, their lush fields, and then they're visited by 3 Norns. Okay, and Norns are witches, for want of a better word, who know the fates. And so when you're born, what they do is they carve your fate onto the roots of the Yggdrasil. It touches the world. And then, so the way you see it is that the old Norse would say their lives are fated. So it doesn't matter if they go into battle. They were going to die. They were going to die. They were going to live. They were going to live. And that's a really key bit of psychology and how things and how they approach their life. I mean, there's no point sitting at home, because if you're going to die, you're going to die, and if you're going to live, you're going to live. So you might as well be in battle, to doing something good. And so these Norns who understood fate, quite important. To me, that's a bit like the snake in the apple. There's a bit of similar myth there. They have the knowledge of your future, and the snake is through the apple, I guess, is giving knowledge to Eve and then to Adam.
Yeah, most people that are believers will say, no, that the snake's a liar. The snake is wrong, and the snake is bad, because you have one of two options. God either lies, all right, and he's hiding something from man, or God tells the truth and the serpent is a liar. But when they ate the fruit, because it was the woman with the man, it says, ate the fruit, and their eyes were opened, it says, and they knew good and evil. And so when that happened, and the interesting part about this narrative is that God would come down, the main God of the story, would come down with Adam in the garden, and it says he'd walk with Adam in the cool of the day. Like he would walk with him. Well, it's almost like one day God comes down to walk with Adam and he can't find him. Where are you? And Adam says, I'm hiding. I'm naked. Who told you that you were naked? And he says, well, the woman that you gave, started blaming, the woman that you gave me. And then the woman blames the serpent. And it's almost like all three of them are standing before the God, getting judged. The woman, he curses the man, all the day of your life that you work, you'll sweat from the brow. You're going to have thorns and thistles will be produced from the ground. It's going to be hard for you to labor. And you can tell there's agriculture here and there's gardening, because he's like, you're going to have to, it's going to be hard work, and you're going to be really busting your hump and working all day to provide. The woman, he says, you're going to be giving childbirth in pain. Almost like it's almost ties into the snake narrative, because a lot of scholarship wants to say that the snake eating of the fruit concept was actually the act of sex.
Yeah, so heard that before. Lots of red in the snake eyes and like, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, it's hard for me to pin down, but her giving birth in pain, and then the serpent will eat dust. The serpent will be on its belly, eat dust all the days of its life, but that the woman's heel will crush the serpent's head. And I wondered if the serpent will bruise the heel of the woman. It made me think of Achilles, because Achilles' heel, but I might be stretching. I don't know.
Passion, I think. That's a sacrifice for the good thing. That's like Cinderella. We can talk about fairy tales as well in a bit, because there's a lot of myth in those that relates to that. Right. So the other question I've got then is, how do we know Genesis happened like that? I mean, that may seem an odd question. So in Norse myth, we know the creation myth because Odin wanted to find knowledge. So he went towards hell to find a body of an ancient seeress, an ancient sorceress, or witch, you probably think of it as. And he rose her from the dead and spoke to her. And because she was alive at the beginning, she was able to tell him all these things. And that's how he knew about the beginning of the world and how the cosmos was created, because she was there seeing it. Yeah, she was, or wasn't quite that, but yeah, she was it. So, and that's how we get to know that there's the story of this creation. So is there such a thing in Genesis, or is it just assumed that someone was around to see the world created and the garden created?
There's a couple of different theories. The believers want to act like Moses was told the story by God on the mountain at Sinai. So when Moses was getting the law from God, God told him these things. And this is just tradition. It's not like in the text saying this, and Moses, in case you were wondering, all this Genesis stuff was, no, because Dr. Price and other people, like, for example, have pointed out, and I always refer to him because I interview him the most, but like he always constantly quotes the other scholars too, and he knows their names and such, but that Genesis wasn't written by the same authors who wrote, Exodus and other books and things. And we know that this from a different source. There's also this thing called the documentary hypothesis, and there's good reason to think there's the priestly source, and there's other parts of this text that weren't together. Even the creation story wasn't
two parts. Yeah.
Right. It's not one. So to say that how do we know? Because someone told us about it later. There's nowhere in the story
that says
of the
that,
book.
yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a weak spot. You see, I think the Norse done quite well to create this story. And what's interesting about this story is that why the nice world stopped was because Odin basically did. So the Jotuns, these monstrous people, tried to break into the home of the gods, and they destroyed the walls. And this is all partly to do with Loki and that. And, to try and repair it, they made a deal with the gods, or the Jotuns. The gods made a deal with the Jotuns, but they didn't want to pay that deal because it was a bad deal. So Odin threw his spear, kills one of them, and the war breaks out proper. Okay, so the person he kills with a spear, there's some debate about this. To me, I think it's actually the seeress who he raises from the dead to find out the beginning of the world. And you can infer that from some of the language and the script. But there'd be different people thinking different things. But to me, that makes sense because the way she talks, you can almost infer she's blaming Odin for her being dead in the ground. Because it was you who threw the spear, Odin, that killed me. She almost says that. I infer that. So that's quite interesting.
So let me get this straight, if you don't mind. Odin resurrects her from the dead in order to find out about the beginning.
Yes,
now,
but also the end, because she tells the story at the beginning, and then she tells him what happens at Ragnarok, and that's how he finds out about Ragnarok.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Historically, two questions. Historically speaking, when this legend of Odin resurrected, does this come later in the narrative, or we can't tell?
It's the first book in the Poetic Edda, and so the Poetic Edda is a book written by Christian monks slightly after the Prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson, and it is the first poem in that book. So we can infer from that it's probably the most important of the Norse poems, because it is the creation and end of world myth. If you were going to tell a story to someone, that would be, who is new to your culture, that would be the first story.
Okay, so then my next question would be about the Genesis creation of this myth, the beginning of the story. Was Odin there at the beginning?
No, so at the beginning, so the actual wording is, it was cold and there was heat. Okay, and there was actually, and this cold and heat came together, created a mist, and out of the mist created Ymir, this giant cow, and some ice. But it also talks about some other realms being created at the same time, and the mist falling down to these realms, and they're poisonous realms. And they talk about there's a god or a being, seiðr, who sits as a fiery being who sits on the fiery world as part of the hot and cold. And you've got Niflheim, which is for ice giants. So that starts, and then Ymir, as I say, rubs his legs together and creates some beings. The cow licks some ice. Don't ask me where these beings, the cow comes from. It just turns up, licks some ice. They have a party, as you do, as you're floating through the cosmos, and boom, Odin, Vili, and V are the sons of Thor, the first god, like the brothers, and they're the ones who then go on to create the people, kill Ymir.
So where's the tree at in all of this?
So the tree doesn't. Basically, it grows from a seed, in effect, but it isn't very clear on where it's planted. It's just like it grows the cosmos. You can appreciate it's not like a real tree in the world,
right?
But they talk about its roots quite a lot, and the roots go down to the underground realms, like to hell. They're like, so it's just a concept rather than a real tree.
Mm-hmm. So, and is that in the creation story too?
It's a lot of the creation stories in the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian who had editorial freedom on making up what he wanted. the Völuspá, which is the first poem in the Poetic Edda, where the poems are written, which are more likely to be accurate, is quite brief on, because it's a poem, still quite long, on what actually happens. But it's, so you missed that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's any connection to the only thing I think that might be connected is when we start talking about the killing of, and this isn't in the Genesis necessarily, the Genesis account, but the killing of Leviathan that we were talking about off air when I read you from Job. I think it was Job 41. I read most that chapter where it's clear that Yahweh was trying to flex on Job. He was saying, look, can you hook Leviathan? Can you play with him like a bird? Like this beast of a dragon type thing. And it is like a dragon, because as much as people want to make Leviathan become this alligator or something else, he's breathing fire. It's just, you like, I'm sorry, but he's kindling coals with his breath. Okay. You're telling me that they didn't have an imagination then? Like, everyone wants to naturalize these books. They want to make them they want to make sure that this doesn't get too hocus pocus. They want this book to fit reality in the literal sense. And it's like, they don't understand that I think these humans had just as much of an imagination as we do today. And so, he creates the world from the carcass of that dragon in that motif.
That's what's odd about that, is that creation of the world motif is one thing, but the fighting the dragon in the way he does is more the dragon fighting motif, which the storm gods do in the other religions from Vedic culture and Proto-Indo-European and all culture. So it's like it's combined the best of two worlds into one. That myth. I mean, that's a high level view from what you're telling me. I'm sure there's research done on it, but that, to me, it's like a merging of myths there. But it
wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, what's interesting is the next thing that happens. Okay, and this isn't explained in the creation myth or the Völuspá. When the gods and the giants or the Jotuns fight, it's a no-win situation. Everybody's going to die. No one's going to. So they create peace. They decide, okay, and what they all do, and this is quite interesting, is they spit into a jar. Okay, now. Until I actually researched this, I didn't understand why would you do that. But spittle charms, and your saliva charms, they call them, it was actually quite a popular thing. Even in Jesus used spit to cure people of miracles sometimes. You spit on your hand to shake a deal. But so what they were doing is all the gods and all the Jotuns spat into a jar, and from that spit they created a man. And because that man contained spit from everyone, he was the most knowledgeable man ever to exist. Kvasir, I think his name was. And Kvasir means something like or something, or sort of knowledge. And he became a really powerful, knowledgeable man, and he would know the answers to everything. Okay, so and he was used to solve a few sort of bits on the way of the journey through Norse culture. But he eventually got kidnapped by a couple of dwarves, which sort of skipped a bit, because the Norns who turned up, because we got carried away, they asked the gods to create some dwarves, and no one really knows what dwarves are, apart from they probably live in rocks or underground and are very good craftsmen. But dwarves might be the same as elves in Norse mythology, but they also have elves, but they may be the same, because the thing is, in poetry, want words to rhyme, so sometimes the Norse used different words for the same thing, so it would follow the meter of the poem, and so we can't quite tell what's the difference between an elf, a dark elf, and a dwarf, but they're all in there. And anybody watches J.R.R. Tolkien can see this. In fact, there's a list of dwarves' names in the Völuspá poem, a whole couple of pages of names, and they're all characters from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit that J.R.R. Tolkien has literally picked up, like Gandalf's in there and Thor, things like that. So that's where he gets his names from. So dwarves kidnap Kvasir, and they chop him up and make him, and this is where it gets more interesting, into mead. They take his blood, make it into a drink, and if you drink the drink, you become very knowledgeable. That drink is called the mead of poetry. That's quite significant because it seems to align very closely to Soma within the Vedic culture. They have a drink that you drink, and that drink is actually is more like mead with go on to this stone ape theory, mead with mushrooms in it. In effect, if you drank it, it made you high, and it put you in another state of mind.
This is really interesting because I am trying to get the author of the book, what is Immortality Key? The Immortality Key, I think it is, by Brian Murarescu, if I'm pronouncing that correct. Murarescu is pretty much, how it goes. Let me pull this up here because the Immortality Key, Brian C. Murarescu, and in this, he actually goes in to try and argue in this that in the Greeks had the same thing you're talking about here. They had a special drink that you would participate in, and it was really, really interesting to hear him say this. But he believed that the early church, one of the early church fathers, talks about the love feast, the term for love feast, using that for the Eucharist. And I don't know how true this is, but his argument is that the Eucharist meal that they would drink and eat in the first century Christians was this, if you will, mystery school consumption of the deity, which we know that Jesus was saying, "Eat of my flesh, drink of my blood," the Gospel of John. That's definitely not a Jewish thing. That is definitely not something that the Hebrew Bible would condone at all. And of course, in John, the Gospel of John, the latest of them, not in the synoptics, he goes all the way. The author goes all the way in making sure you know that he's talking about his flesh and his blood. Well, Dennis R. MacDonald, the scholar that I talked about on the live and that I interview all the time, in his connections, he shows John, the Gospel of John, is borrowing from Euripides the Bacchae. Dionysus is another god. And in the mythology of Dionysus, when the, what was the name of the big gods? They ate him. They crunched him in their teeth. And
Titans.
The Titans. Yes, the Titans. And they ground him up and they ate his flesh and his blood in the narrative. And so there was this tradition to eat and drink the blood of Dionysus. Well, Jesus comes on and does the same thing. So I wonder if we go back far enough, if these traditions become one or come from the same source. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they do. Because if the Vedic are doing it, so it's gone to India, and to get to India, it must have gone through Iran and Persia. And Germania's got it, and the Nordic have got it, and the Greeks have got it, and the Romans have got it. Guess where it's to come from? The Proto-Indo-Europeans. And the reason it's come from them, and this may sort of help, I would say, disprove the stoned ape theory a bit, is that these mushrooms grow on, or particularly found on cow pats. So where cows poo, you tend to find lots of mushrooms. And what did the humans start to do about 6,000-7,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago? They were farming. They got the cows. And what would be a secondary or byproduct of it? Mushrooms.
I have a hard time not thinking there's some role in psychedelics for sure. I mean,
Absolutely.
whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's so. I would love to speak to Dr. Robert about the Odin hanging. So to me, that part. So Odin knows about Ragnarok, okay, and he has to go away and find out more. He wants more. He wants magic, and it talks about him hanging from the tree. Okay. Now, some people who know a lot about Christianity and hear a bit of Norse myth think, oh, that's very similar to Christ hanging on a cross. But actually, if you read the Norse stanzas in the Havamal, which is where this is from, it actually says that Odin goes without food and drink, and he screams and he looks down, and he's actually, in effect, fasting. He's going through a ritual process, rather like people talk about the Sami culture, this shamanism. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but there's an element to that where he's actually going through a process in his mind on psychedelics to try and find the answers to this magic, and that's where he gets the magic of the runes from, doing that. Well, that's my interpretation. So
I heard Dr. Price say, and I got that video, it's on my Patreon. He pretty much thinks that there's the idea, and I don't know how true it is, that Christians influenced these Nordic writings later. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah, because they authored the manuscripts like the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, there's that influence. Right. But the poems themselves, because we think they're more true, I said I'd love to have a chat with him. We believe writings there are probably actually quite authentic, and the stories are pre-Christian.
Right.
Some of them.
And that is interesting, though, that you talked about him hanging on the tree, not eating and not drinking, because there, and this may not be a connection. I'm just throwing it out there. We know Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, but so did Moses for 40 days and 40 nights. And almost like this wilderness experience. They both go through this wilderness testing experience. And then what's interesting in the Jesus narrative is that while he's in this 40-day, 40-night experience, the devil, Satan, comes to tempt him and test him during this time, through this phase. It just makes you wonder, like, what is this trying to, what's this mean? What's it trying to say? Can we quite understand it? I don't know.
To me, it's just a standard, I say standard, it's probably a word to call it, but when you go through this process of consuming this mead of poetry or this summer or this, people go through a very similar experience. So it's not surprising, all of them don't feel hungry, thirsty, and they all imagine these things. So to me, it's just a common thing. But to digress a bit on the stoned ape theory, if the mushrooms tend to grow on manure, then there'd be a plentiful source of food for the apes, and they wouldn't have to worry about eating the mushrooms because you've got the cows there, or the cows eating. So to me, there's just that would be my basic thought on inferring that perhaps the stoned ape theory isn't a major influence in the evolution of Homo sapien.
I don't know if it's only that, but the idea that they're just hypothesizing that the ape comes down, it's flipping over cow patties, and it's eating of the mushrooms. But there are plenty of plants that have psychedelic effect, some type of dimethyltryptamine or something in it that's going to make you trip.
Would it be beneficial to live in? It wouldn't be beneficial for someone to be in that state of mind, or an animal to be in that state of mind.
Well, that's why they're saying, I suspect microdosing is what they think they're doing. They're not like consuming as much as possible. They're taking a little bit at a time, and
it just makes the brain possibly, because they're talking about the jump of Homo sapiens of 70,000 years ago to leave Africa, and the speech happened like just before that. There was a change in how we talked, and they thought, that was a change. That, who knows whether that was affected by taking anything or just a genetic change? Who knows? But these things do happen. I can't deny that they do.
It makes me wonder, man. I don't know, because I mean, it's like this. It's like someone might try to disagree with this, and I get it. That's fine. But why are we drawn to wine? Why is the human civilization so drawn to an effect that we gain from drinking a substance called wine or beer or alcohol in any way? We do the same thing. There's an effect that we get, and we enjoy the effect. Well, to act like ancients couldn't have enjoyed the ingestion of plants or mushrooms of some sort to enjoy the effect, or even beyond that, not just did they enjoy it the same way we enjoy beer or wine or alcohol or any other chemical that we ingest. It was a pathway to another dimension for them in a way. They got to meet the gods. They didn't just got to talk about them. They got to see them. They got to experience. I know from tripping before. So I've seen some things, while I've tripped. So I'm not here. This is not a promotion of doing these things. I'm just saying your mind will really, take you to another place. And I wonder if and that was me consuming a lot. I consumed enough to escape reality. Whereas if you're microdosing, they say there are some advantages to microdosing on mushrooms and things like that. I heard.
So, certainly antidepressant wise, that's been
Right.
talked about. I've seen that. So, but yes, so the mead of poetry and summer, this psychobin type liquid was drunk from the Proto-European onwards, definitely. It may be early European farmers. So, 8,000 years ago, easily. So that's quite interesting. So, so this was obviously a very powerful liquid, and the gods didn't want the dwarves to own this. The gods wanted the power, not the dwarves. So there then follows an elaborate story of how Odin gets this mead of poetry, which basically involves him turning into someone else, convincing all the workers of a giant managed to get the mead of poetry off the dwarves. He had to get off the giant. He basically kills all the giant's helpers, becomes the help of the giant himself, and through that then manages to get to the giant's friend, who actually has the mead, goes there, but the giant's daughter's looking after it, and so Odin sits on her golden throne, which is a metaphor for marrying her, let's say, for a few days. She trusts him, and then he changes into an eagle, flies off with the mead of poetry. The giant who owned it changes into an eagle, follows him, and just as Odin gets to the gods with the mead of poetry in his chest, because he's drunk it all, ready to spit it all out, he drops a little, and it lands on man's sort of farmland, man's ground. And that's why man has a little knowledge, and Odin spits the rest of it onto the gods, and they've got all the knowledge.
Interesting.
And that's how that's the apple story, in effect.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, they ate one fruit, and then they get kicked out of the garden, and he doesn't want them to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good, or the tree of life. I'm sorry. He says, kick them out, because if they eat of the tree of life, they'll live forever. So, I want the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, it's a knowledge tree. It's common sense to me that this is, but there's also the idea of immortality that plays a huge role in the narrative of Genesis, as well as the narrative that it's borrowing from in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Enuma Elish. I mean, so yeah, the idea is he goes and swims down to get the plant after trying to find the plant that will make him live forever. And when he comes back up after working so hard, he had to rest because he was so tired from having to swim so far down to the bottom of the sea to get it. And when he comes up, he goes to sleep, and he wakes up, the plant's gone, and the plant was stolen by a serpent. Yeah.
So yes, so we have apples. There are other apple stories then in Nordic myth. So Odin is a goddess who's in charge of youthfulness.
Who?
Idun, I think her name is IDN. I think it's like IDUN. And so she has these golden apples which allow the gods to stay youthful. And so if she's ever kidnapped, all the gods get old. That's another story. So Loki gets up to his tricks. She ends up getting kidnapped because of his errors, and he does save the day. So Loki's this person who tends to cause problems, but also fix them. So we have this golden apple creates youthfulness within the Nordic sort of culture. So again, that may relate a little bit to that story of the Tree of Life.
Yeah, I definitely know that when they got kicked out of the garden, they go on to live for a certain amount of time. It was a long time, but they die. And their lives are longer than, obviously they have very long genealogies. The oldest known genealogy is like 969 years, Methuselah, but we have good reason to think this comes from the Babylonian king list. The Babylonian king list had certain kings that lived thousands of years, and we have good reason to think that this is being utilized from that in the genealogy. And there's some good reason. I got a good buddy of mine, Russell Gamirkin. I'm going to be interviewing him coming up next week, where he has a theory that the Old Testament's much newer than you think. It might be like 2nd, 3rd century BC, not as old as you think. It might be borrowing from stories that are in literature that are probably around, that are older, but he believes it was created around that time. And he uses this theory talking about a man named Berosus, who was a Babylonian priest in the third century, I think third century, fourth century, something like that, BC. But Berosus actually was a priest, and he knew how to read Greek, but also knew how to read the Sumerian. And he pretty much needed to translate the Sumerian epics and whatnot into Greek for everyone in the Alexandrian library, and all of the people in, if you will, in Hellenized Greek times, to be able to read the Sumerian stories. So he translates it, but he also, there's the idea that there's a lot of literature being used from Berosus, and then there's Manetho. Manetho was an Egyptian priest who's borrowing, trying to, if you will, translate his Egyptian stories and text into Greek for the Greeks to understand the Egyptian narrative. And out of Manetho's writings, he mentions strange things like about Moses and stuff that, like, why are you talking about Moses? And the idea is that Jewish priests and scribes took these a combination of ideas from the Babylonian and the Egyptian and whatnot, and created their own narratives in the Bible that we see today. So I don't know if there's anything else being borrowed, but I know that there's borrowing going on.
And that would explain why I can't connect the Abrahamic religion directly to Proto-Indo-Europeans, because it's not only gone through Mesopotamia and Sumerian and Assyrians, but you've also got this Egyptian flavour thrown in, which, and that changed things quite dramatically. That would make sense why it isn't so clear cut. Yes.
It's definitely not clear cut, because you have in the Bible's narrative the Tower of Babel, where everyone was of one tongue, and then they are trying to reach heaven and
exactly.
The gods strike them down and say no, and they all start speaking, and he confuses them with different tongues. Is there anything like that in
no. It's so as the culture matures, find that the underlying narrative of Nordic culture, which is pretty much war and survival, takes over. You get stories like that, so they're more interested in how strong they are and epic. So reputation is everything in Norse. Okay, so there's a story. I forgot his name. It's not Jarl, but there's a story of one particular Viking raider who goes raiding, and he comes across this farmland. Okay, and he goes to raid it. And what you mustn't do in Norse culture is take without saying you've taken something, because that's stealing. You can take something, but you have to go to the person, I've just taken your stuff, what are you going to do about it? And again, you can't just kill someone, it's bad. You have to say, I want to fight you, and you have a fight, and if you kill him, that's fine. So this chap, Egil, I think it is, Egil, he finds his farm, and with his friends, they raid it, but they get captured by the farmer. Okay, they all get tied up in a barn, and the farmer and his friends all party all night saying, we call the Vikings, we call the Vikings. Well, Egil manages to escape, and he gets his friends untied, and they take all the farmer's possessions and run off with them in the middle of the night. Then Egil goes, no, stop. We've just stolen stuff without telling the farmer we've taken it. So what he does as an old Norse Viking, he says, I'm going to go back and tell the farmer. And all his friends go, no, don't do that. That's daft. You don't want to do that. But no, he goes back to the farmhouse. He knocks on the door. Right, he sets the roof alight of this farmhouse, and everybody tries to run out. And he goes, I'm you, Jill. I've stolen your stuff, and now I'm killing you, and chops people up as they run out of the house, basically. The house collapses, and he walks back to his friends saying, sorted them out. And that's how you get a good reputation for being a Viking and Old Norse.
That's pretty tough, man. Yeah, that's pretty tough.
So and that's the narrative they had. They liked those kind of stories. They weren't necessarily worried about different cultures and people talking and things like that. It was more about war, because it's quite a later narrative. What we hear, the stories tend to feel like they were written later on. So probably second half of the first millennia. It feels like a lot of these narratives actually came together, and that's when there was a lot. That's when Viking raiding started to happen. That's when Iceland was eventually found and populated.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense why they would have a myth, and this is just me completely just making an opinion here, why they would have a myth of all the different languages during a Hellenistic time. With why is everybody speaking different tongues, and you definitely have Alexander the Great trying to Hellenize many people to speaking one language, but it could explain. It's a mythology trying to explain
It's a
why
reason,
everyone
yeah.
speaks different languages, but the building that they're saying they're building to heaven is very much like a ziggurat, and the Babylonians had a ziggurat, and so that's where a lot of people say, hey, this early Genesis account is actually Babylonian in nature. But then when you get into Moses and Exodus and stuff, you find like Moses's name is an Egyptian name.
Yes,
And
Ramesses.
so,
Some people I think have associated with it.
yeah, some people associate him with Ramesses, but it is the story itself takes place in Egypt.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's like you have Babylon, you have Egypt, and you kind of have to wonder, like, is Russell Gamirkan correct in his trying to figure out, was this created in the Alexandrian library later in time? There's no telling, but I do enjoy this whole conversation on the Genesis. We haven't really spent much time on the end. What is Ragnarok? What does that mean? What is it? The Christian worldview, I suspect, to an idea that the end is going to end in fire,
brimstone, and all that. So there's no particular cause for Ragnarok. Something bad doesn't happen that makes the gods angry. That isn't what happens. It's basically part of it's to do with Fenrir. So Fenrir is Loki's child, and he's a big wolf. And his jaws are so big that his bottom of his jaw touches the ground and the top of his mouth touches the sky. He's got a big mouth, so it's a big old wolf. And it just talks that one day he will escape and eat people and kill people. So this happens. There's a cockerel that crows in hell, and that cockerel is actually a name of fire, and there's some association with this fire cockerel. But that signals the start. Then Loki appears on a ship made of fingernails with other creatures by his side, heading towards the gods. And this whole talk that Surtur comes along, and Surtur is this flaming hot being type god who was there at the beginning of the cosmos, and he's there to put an end to it all. So and basically everybody kills everybody else. There's a few gods left. Surtur burns everything, and then there's winter for 3 years, I think it is, and then it goes back to peace and harmony. And then this Nithhogger, who was gnawing at the roots of the Yggdrasil, in the Völuspá anyway, says that he then flies over valleys with bodies made of wings. All his wings are made of bodies, and that's sort of all you hear in the world, and the cycle almost starts again.
So I've heard some numbers that parallel Ragnarok in the Bible, actually. Okay. Let me see. How do you spell Ragnarok? Okay, Ragnarok and Genesis, if I'm not mistaken. There is a definite supposed connection, at least numerically speaking. There's some common numbers. You find this really strange. I'll have to get it up with you. I really would like to show you some of the comparisons. Yeah, there's some numbers that kind of compare in between these mythologies, because isn't there a certain amount of people that are supposed to go into Ragnarok?
There's Valhalla. So
Valhalla, yes.
Valhalla. So Valhalla is a sort of an anglicised version. So back in the 18th, 19th century, scholars put an A at the end of most words. So Valhalla became Valhalla. And that's a place where once Odin found out about Ragnarok through the dead witch he raised, she said, this is how the world started, this is how it's going to end, because she had prophecy. he thought, I'll create an army. And he sort of made a deal with Hel, and Hel was Loki's daughter who ran the underworld, you could look at it as. And the deal was that after a battle, Odin would get 50% of the dead. Okay, so what that would normally mean that if you have a battle and half the people died, or some people died, they would probably be the weak people. So why would you want an army of weak people? Well, Odin was known to manipulate battles to get the best people, so the best one. In fact, he found heroes through various myths. You hear these stories, there's a hero, and Odin makes him become stronger and better, and then makes him die. So he gets him into Valhalla. And Valhalla could only hold a certain number of people. And that may be the numbers you're talking.
Yeah, I think there's 432.
That's number of doors in Valhalla. So the hall has 432 doors, I think it is.
Yeah, I'm reading here. It says there are a number of reasons why this number is interesting. So keep on reading. First of all, we have a similar account of a troop tally in the first lay of Helgi Hundingsbana, Helgi's Hundingsbane, in which the hero states that there are 1,200 trusty men, though in Hatuna, isn't that funny? 1,200? 1,200, that's just 12, the number 12 with zeros added to it. Twice as many, stanza 25. Let us do this calculation twice like we did above, but this time we shall start with numbers at face value. Maybe they're doing stuff that I'm not familiar with, but I did hear 432,000 in saying on this webpage there's an Indo-European connection, but 432 is interesting. I think there's some significance, man. There's a numerological significance. They did a lot of this with numbers, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the dimensions that he creates the ark, because it's a cube. The face value, when you calculate it, I can't remember exactly how you do the calculations, but my buddy at Sacred Geometry Decoded YouTube channel, he talks about this stuff. It calculates to 144,000. And if you go to the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, the last book in the New Testament, he talks about only 144,000 enter into the New Jerusalem. And then you can look at the cube, the New Jerusalem that is a cube, and its dimensions, and find the significance of 144 as well. So there's some type of connection here on what they're doing numerically.
Yeah, maybe. That's interesting. So yes, that's where the numbers are. So there's this army, which obviously didn't win Ragnarok. The serpent came along. But yes, that's it. So it just talks about the underworld, and the world recycles. And that was, as I say, an important concept. So it didn't get, what's the word when you're reborn someone?
Reincarnated?
Reincarnated, yeah. It wasn't that. You didn't get that, but the world just restarted and people lived again. Just went through this cycle. And Ragnarok could still happen, and it could happen every 1,000 years or million years.
Well, it's weird because if you take Revelation, which is highly symbolic in many ways, the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, and it seems like it comes down out of heaven to earth. So once all the chaos and the crazy and the fire and the fighting and the death and all the four horsemen come, and they destroy, then it's almost like, all right, now the new heavens and new earth, the New Jerusalem comes down to earth, and it's supposed to be blissful again, or it's almost like another garden. Yeah. Because at the end of Revelation, it talks about a garden. But I was going to say something. You mentioned in your tree of the Genesis, there were 4, what was they? Are they birds or something?
Norns, women, witches.
Yeah, but you were talking about something else before that.
Oh, there was 4 stags. An eagle, 4 stags, 4 male deer, in effect.
Okay, because there's no 4 stags in the Genesis account, but there is 4 rivers that come out of the garden.
Ah, right. So we have rivers running from the roots of the Yggdrasil to Niflheim and other places, and to Hell. So they talk about those, and a maelstrom in one of them, poisonous mist. So they talk about that sort of effect as well.
It's interesting because in the garden, it says there's one river, but out of that river shoot 4 different rivers, if you will.
And people have used that to try and work out where Eden was. I've read that somewhere. They've come up with some various theories. Obviously,
I just don't know if there's a connection between the 4 stags but it's not literary in any literal sense, but the number 4, I could be really stretching
I don't know. But I mean, there's a standard want of humans to understand the things they didn't understand. And that's where the stories come from. So if you didn't understand why rivers flowed, you didn't understand why mountains were so tall or the moon did what it did, make up these stories to explain why they did them. That's all that's happening today.
Interesting. So what happens when we die?
So if you don't go to Valhalla, most of you will go to hell. Okay, and hell is where, not your hell though, a different hell. Not the hell stolen from the Persians, I think it was. The Abrahamic got this. It's a different hell, but it's Loki's daughter, who's Hel, and that's the name, Hel, and she's described as being sort of greeny, bluey, half dead colour. Sort of imagine a decomposing corpse. It's almost that sort of colour. You imagine a head, and people go there. And what happens sometimes is that when people go to hell, you can still go to hell and visit them. So hell was a place they actually thought you could go to, very north and very underground, and there were gates to hell. Gates to hell you had to pass. I think it was 7. I've just been making it up, but yeah, you went there, and so like Odin had to go to hell to resurrect the Ceres. But yeah, other people who died. There's a famous story of Sigurd, who's appears in lots of Nordic myths as a sort of a hero character. That's amazing stuff. And Hild is his girlfriend. They didn't actually get. It's a very complicated story. They should have got married, but they didn't. They were tricked. She slept with someone else, married someone else, but it wasn't her fault. Anyway, but she goes to hell. They're both killed or burned at the same time, and some myth talks about how she travels to hell and how giants see her on the way to hell, and they question, why are you going to hell? We don't want you here. You're nasty. And she has to explain, actually, no, I was tricked into being nasty. I'm really a nice person. And she's allowed to carry on, and she can meet her buddy in hell. So it's almost like another realm.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of funny. I've never heard a story that's like denying people access to hell in terms of, I mean, like at least in the Christian worldview. Yeah. Now, I've heard of in the Greco-Roman, Greek ideas that, Hercules has the 3-headed dog, I can't even think, Cerberus.
Yes,
and he's taken Cerberus down to Hades. Yeah. But Hades could be visited, but I don't think you could leave Hades. That's the only catch. And
you
whereas
could get souls from it, I believe you could capture souls from there. Surely.
I'm not sure. I don't know. You probably, you would know more than I would. Let me ask you this, because we could go on and on and on. Is there any good movies that ever been done that I know they don't compare to writings? Okay. Books are better by far, but I'm saying, are there any cool movies that you would recommend for people to watch and enjoy?
The only one that I'd say is close to reality is one with Antonio Banderas in it. His name I forget, and it's about someone called Ibn Farthen, I think his name is, and he's an Arab, and he journeys along with some Vikings. So he's probably around Anatolia, that sort of area, or maybe even Arabia. And he's actually wrote a book of his travels, and in the book, so you could get a book like it's a Penguin classic. He's got a page or two describing the Viking funeral, and so the film has that in it, but also some other things around the Viking journey, how the Arab sees the Viking journey. So if you search for him and Vikings, probably a film will pop up, like Forgotten Kingdom or something. I don't. But that's probably the only one that nothing comes as close. I really wish there were good films. I mean, there's Viking TV series sort of hopped in between myths, and he done very well. I mean, some of the acting, certainly in the first few seasons, was very good with the Ragnar Lothbrok, and that's a half a story of the saga of the Volsungs. So where I talked about Sigrid, he had children, and Ragnarok was one of his children. Oh, Ragnar was one of his children. That's described in the Saga of Volsunds and the story of Ragnar Lothbrok. And that's because really short read. So if someone's not really into reading but want to understand it, Saga of Volsunds, I think Dr. Jackson Crawford's written a good translation. You could probably read it in a few days. That really gives you an idea of that kind of story. Real epic.
Yeah, I want to get into reading this stuff and discuss it more and start seeing if there's a connection between these. So I'm sure you've already done some of this stuff, or at least looking from your point of view over. I'm definitely wanting to come over and on your side and see what you have. I think this was an excellent show. I think this is really, really fun. I don't want to keep going for the sake of brevity and people watching.
But we've got a good subject matter. We haven't wandered too far, Derek, for once.
Yeah, because I felt like we were kind of all over the place, but I felt like we did good, man. I do think like we did really, really well on sticking to. I thought we did good.
Sign of a good mind, Derek. That is, having that good conversation. Staying with a couple of thousand years of history.
Yes, I think we did a pretty good job here. Anyone who's watching, make sure you guys go to John's YouTube channel. And be sure to definitely subscribe, because he goes into stuff far more in depth. I've noticed that you do a lot of editing into your stuff too. You'll put cool visuals and stuff to give people kind of a feeling behind what. Yeah, and there's a lot more. You get into the scholars on your research, and you've studied quite a bit of them. How long have you been studying this stuff?
In hardcore, about 20 years. So.
All those books behind you?
All the books behind me. I've done university courses at various universities. But I don't try and shout about it. I'm just want to be a guy on the internet who's just likes teaching things. I get fed up of hearing stories that aren't true or miss out the important narrative underneath that causes the story people are talking about. That's what I like to say. Actually, the reason that story happened is this. Do you know this? Or this was the impact of the story, and that's what exists. They're the things that interest me.
Yeah, I really do appreciate. I can tell that you're really into this, and you know that there are various views in certain ways. There's some people that disagree and why. Absolutely. And that's what I do with Christianity and the Abrahamic stuff. Like, I like to hear the reasons why and the differences and stuff. So I definitely recommend you guys go check him out. You get into the Nordic, Germanic, Celtic, and Proto-Indo-European stuff, getting deep into that. Subscribe to his channel, and it'll be down in the description too, so you cannot miss where the link is, and make sure you guys do that. Thank you, John, for joining me, brother.
Thanks, Derek. Great discussion.
And don't forget, I'll see you in Valhalla, but we are Myth Vision.
I have hundreds of videos on the Patreon. Become a patron and get early access to everything I ever launch. Join the Twitter. I've got a Discord chat room. You guys can help grow the community. One-time PayPal or Cashapp if you want to help us out with a donation. And join our Facebook groups, man. Let's make this thing happen.